In this introduction to Matthew's Gospel, we're going to just look at Matthew chapter 1 and what's actually going on here in the chapter. So the chapter begins with portraying Jesus as the heir to the Davidic throne. That is a kind of a promise that is made in the Old Testament that to David that one of his descendants would sit on a throne. And so what this genealogy is doing is trying to um, present Jesus as a person who is going to fulfill that promise. So in other words, he is the Messianic king by God's providential care. And people have noticed that actually this genealogy is not a genealogy that is full or complete. I mean, there's not enough names in between, say, Abraham and David, or between David and the deportation to of Jews to Babylon, mentioned in verse 12, or from Babylon to the Joseph, the one who married Mary. So there's not enough names. So it's a selective genealogy, and it's with 14 names. And so there's been a lot of discussions about why number 14. I think the thing that's most important probably is that 14 happens to be the numerical value for David's name. So in Hebrew, David's name has three consonants. There are no vowels, and so there are three consonants. And in the Hebrew language, each consonant has a numerical value. So for David's name, that value is 14. And the fact that it's three sets of 14 is also seems to be kind of significant. Three is again, seen as a number that has the value or the symbolism of complete. And so the idea is that at the right time, according when the time has come to its kind of completeness, the heir to the promise is now being born. So a couple of things that's interesting about the genealogies. One is that there are names or references to four women. So we have that the wife of Uriah her name is Bathsheba, and so she's not named, but she is referred to. We also have Ruth, who is named, and we also have Tamar, who is named, and we also have Rahab, who is named. So we have these women, and usually the genealogies don't include women's names. So that's kind of curious. A couple of things about these women. Of course, all of these women have some kind of sexual scandal or sexual scenarios with them. So Rahab is a prostitute, and Tamar is a woman who dresses like a prostitute, who has sex with her father-in-law in order to have a child because she was left childless. And Ruth, there's this story about Ruth who, in order to kind of entice Boaz to marry her after her husband has died, she, quotes, uncovers his feet and sleeps at his feet, and he finds her in the morning. So there's some kind of sexual innuendo possibly in that activity. And of course, with David and Bathsheba, David, in a sense, we don't know if she willingly goes to the king or what, but David sees her bathing and calls her and sleeps with her. So we might see it as some kind of rape. But again, it's an adulterous situation. So we have these women who are kind of in this line, and they all have some kind of sexual innuendos or scandal. So of course then we have Mary, and Mary's going to have this child, but it's not going to be from Joseph. She's going to be pregnant without having have had sexual intercourse with Joseph. And so there's something of a cloud of suspicion or sexual innuendo that's with that. Also, I would just note that the genealogy is quite interesting in that really the genealogy only goes to Joseph. And it makes it quite clear that Joseph is not Jesus's biological father. So the genealogy doesn't show us the bloodline of Jesus, since he's a child of Mary, and we don't have Mary's genealogy. We only have Joseph's. So in one sense, he becomes a lot in the line, or the heir of the David throne, kind of through an adoption into that line through Joseph. So Joseph becomes his legal father, and well, Mary is his mother. So that's a curious thing with the genealogy. It's quite odd. So as I mentioned, we have these women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And Bathsheba is not named. So the genealogy does differ from Luke's genealogy, and so anybody who wants to compare that, and again, there has to be some kind of explanations for it. Some scholars have sought to resolve the tensions, claiming that maybe Matthew gives Joseph's natural lineage and Luke gives Joseph's legal lineage, but in both cases, it is Joseph's line that is given, not Mary's. So neither Matthew or Luke gives Jesus's genealogy, or Matthew gives Joseph's ancestry while Luke gives Mary's, or vice versa. But to claim that one of them is giving Mary's is really to read into the genealogy, because it doesn't state that it's Mary's; it only states that it's Joseph's. So I think probably what we have here is two genealogies, and the genealogies are different. And we just have to recognize that that's what we have, and try to make sense of why there are the differences. Other scholars see that there's no need to resolve the differences. You just allow the differences to exist, and recognize how do people actually keep records of genealogies. What do we know about keeping records, and what are their other purposes? Of course, one of the big differences between Matthew and Luke's genealogies that Matthew goes back to Abraham, and that then sets that Jesus' Jewishness. In other words, he gets adopted into this Jewish lineage as a descendant of Abraham. We can assume that Mary's ancestry also comes from Abraham, most likely. Whereas Luke decides to go all the way back to Adam, and for him, it's this descendancy that is for the benefit of all humanity. So Adam is kind of the representation for all humans. So Luke is kind of sensitive, or knows that the Christian message is going to eventually go not just to Jews, but also to Gentiles. So Matthew is recalling Genesis by claiming Joseph's father is Jacob in this time. So this line with Jacob takes us back to Genesis. So it ties it back into the great kind of narrative of the people of Israel coming from the line of Jacob, because Abraham has other children. Isaac, besides Isaac, he has Ishmael, and Isaac has another son, Esau, besides Jacob. And so seeing the line going through the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob line in particular. All right, I'll conclude as well with this kind of introduction, starting this introduction to set that Jesus is the anticipated David king. Taking a look here at Matthew 1:18-25. So a couple of things about this virgin conception. So, of course, it's sometimes raised that this virgin conception is just another ancient pregnancy myth. And it is true that there are pregnancy myths that exist in ancient literature. But, there are some things we have to recognize about this pregnancy myth. And one is that this story doesn't indicate any sexual intercourse between the divine or with God and with Mary. Instead, there's this kind of miraculous conception that occurs, and there's also another thing about this thing that's kind of curious, whether or not you know, Matthew or a community or whether invented this idea of a virgin conception. That's problematic because um, there's no need for a virgin conception for the Messiah, for Jesus to be Messiah, because no Jews are expecting a Messiah to be born of a conception. Now, that brings us to this text that's cited in Matthew chapter 1 and in verse 23. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. So this is coming from the Septuagint version of Isaiah. And so for many Christians, what's happening, and Matthew seems to be presenting this kind of fulfillment of the Isaiah passage with Jesus' birth. But a couple of things need to be noted here. First of all, in the Isaiah passage, the actual fulfillment, or what the Isaiah prophecy is directed towards, is the birth of a son who will come soon. And that son is going to be Hezekiah. Hezekiah really fulfills the prophecy. But what Matthew is doing here is he is seeing a kind of a better fulfillment, or a fuller fulfillment, or a deeper fulfillment in the Isaiah passage. And it ties in more closely with Mary's conception. So in the Hebrew, in the Isaiah passage, the word that's used for the woman who conceives, Alma, just means a young woman, a young maiden. It says nothing in Isaiah that she will be a virgin. But when the Hebrew text is translated into Greek, into the Septuagint authors used a specific word that does mean a virgin, and so that's what gets used here. And so then what's connected here is with the understanding of Mary being a virgin, and seeing in the Isaiah passage how that passage is fulfilled in the birth of Jesus. So as a direct answer to the question, well, Isaiah 7:14 gets fulfilled with the birth of Hezekiah, but Jesus' birth to a virgin is a subsequent fulfillment of this prophecy, especially in light of how it was translated in the Septuagint. So it ends then by mentioning the name, and he shall be called, name shall be Emmanuel. Now, Hezekiah wasn't named Emmanuel, nor is Jesus really named Emmanuel. But this name Emmanuel means God is with his people. And so the prophecy was trying to indicate when Jews were being surrounded, Jerusalem, Judea was being surrounded by their enemies, to let them know that God is going to be with his people. This child is going to be born, and until that child gets to a certain age, then you'll see that these enemies that now threaten you will be gone. So that's the sign of God's presence. But so he wasn't called Emmanuel. And same thing with Jesus. Jesus is not called Emmanuel, but his birth is the indication that God is with his people. This idea, this theology of God being with his people when they are surrounded by their enemies. And in Matthew's gospel, there is a sense of hostility that exists. There are threats, there are persecutions, particularly from non-Christian Jews in their synagogues, maybe their synagogue leaders. And despite any hostilities or threats to them, God is going to be with them. It kind of really bookends Matthew, because you have not only that God is with you here at the beginning in the citation of Isaiah, but at the very end when Jesus gives his kind of great commission to disciples, he tells them, lo, I am with you always. So this idea of the presence of God through Jesus is the sign of his presence with his people. So chapter 1 starts off, or Matthew's gospel starts off with chapter 1, trying to emphasize that God is fulfilling his the promise for bringing an heir to David's throne, and God is communicating to his covenant people that he is going to be with them um, in Jesus as the Messiah.